Hi. In today's world, we have cars, planes, and advanced medical knowledge. None of this would be possible without the effects of World War I. Hi, my name is Noah Brown. I'm with Channel 9's News, and today we'll be covering a brief history of World War I. To understand what caused World War I, we have to look at the acronym called MAIN, which stands for Militarism, Alliances, Imperialism, and Nationalism. We can see these examples in World War I exemplified with first, the German military. The German military in the 1910s was one of the most advanced militaries and one of the largest standing armies. This caused a lot of uneasy tensions in other European countries like Britain, France, and Poland because they did not equate to the military power of Germany. This caused the second acronym of MAIN, alliances. As they were fearful for times of war, they started making secret alliances with each other in time, just in case. Another example of how MAIN is seen throughout World War I is with imperialism. The start of World War I comes from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was to be heir to the Austria and Hungary throne. And no, not that Franz Ferdinand, this Franz Ferdinand. He was assassinated by a Serbian group known as the Black Hand because of imperialism. They had control over what is known as modern-day Bosnia and Yugoslavia, and that group wanted freedom from Franz Ferdinand. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand caused a kind of domino effect with a lot of countries declaring war on each other, one after another, which is why we got the results of World War I. Another example of MAIN that isn't really seen in World War I is nationalism. An example of this is during World War I, many of the sides like Germany versus Britain didn't hold real animosity towards each other. If you look at how the citizens of each country interact with each other, they still saw each other as normal people, friends, family, even playing football games after the day the war was declared. Even though there was a war currently raging on in Europe, America would not be present until the 1917s because of our isolationist mindsets. Although we would still trade weapons and money in the war, we did not actively participate in the war ourselves until 1917 when, knock knock, it's the Americans. Although in the beginning America did decide to stay neutral, our moment of deciding to join the war was when we discovered the Zimmermann Telegraph. The Zimmermann Telegraph was a message sent from a German ambassador named Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico. This message was intercepted by British code breakers and brought to President Woodrow Wilson's attention. Now, Woodrow Wilson did promise famous in his 1916 campaign that he would keep us out of the ongoing war in Europe. But when the Zimmermann Telegraph was brought to him, he went to Congress with a declaration of war that was passed with a vote of 373 to 50, with one of the 50 no's being the first woman that was ever voted into Congress. Many key effects from World War I did not just come from the fighting and the general war itself, but mainly came from the peace talks that came after the war. For example, with the Paris peace talks was a meeting between the big three, with America with Woodrow Wilson, France with George, who I can't really say his name too well, and then David Lloyd George for Britain. Even though Russia did participate and fight in a majority of the war, at this time they also went through the Bolsheviks revolution, which means that this was the new communist regime of Russia, and that the big three also did not recognize Russia as a true country yet, so they did not include Russia in peace talks, even though they did fight a majority of the war. Another country that they did keep from peace talks was also Germany, and the reason why this is so important is because without German representation, though they started the war, it does not properly ensure that Germany is getting the respect and treatment that it would need for a country to thrive. For example, a lot of the European leaders and representatives pushed for the war clause guilt, which means that Germany would have to pay back all of the damages that was caused to the other countries throughout the war. This would severely cripple Germany and would lead to disgruntled people that were looking at Hitler's promises later. Another example of how diplomacy was really shown after World War I was Woodrow Wilson with his 14 points in the League of Nations. For example, Woodrow Wilson, because he had to make so many concessions to the other political parties and the other representatives that are at the Paris peace talks, the League of Nations could not be fully fleshed out and given the powers they needed to prevent the further escalation of wars in the future. For example, World War I with Hitler taking over Poland or Hitler taking over Czechoslovakia. So one of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was the League of Nations, which was an organization that was meant to stop global conflict of global war. Example, to stop another world war. In order to get the League of Nations passed, Woodrow Wilson did compromise on many of his 14 points that allowed France and Britain to take advantage of Germany or the Weimar Republic by taking either some of its land, some of its factory, or making it pay a yearly debt. One of the bigger diplomatic mistakes with World War I was the League of Nations. Again, as I've said before, the League of Nations was used to try to spot future conflicts. But because that the League of Nations did not have a standing army, it cannot enforce its decisions on its own. It relied on its member countries to enforce that decision. And coming out of World War I, Britain and France were actually terrified of going into another world war, so they would not enforce these rules, which let Germany control more power again, leading to the rise of World War II, with Hitler taking Poland and Czechoslovakia. And now on to my co-host, Gabriel Cash.
Thank you for that, Noah. And if you're just now joining us, this is Channel 15 News, where we're diving into a brief history of World War One, also known as the Great War. Thanks to my amazing co-hosts, we've already covered the key individuals who shaped this global conflict and the political forces that drove the world into chaos. Now we turn into something that hits every nation harder in wartime, the economy. And let me tell you, it was a mess. While some nations floundered under sheer economic strains, others, well, let's just say they found a way to profit. The biggest losers in this financial catastrophe? Europe. France, Britain, and Germany were bleeding money almost as fast as they were losing soldiers. Entire fields were torn apart by artillery fire, because after all, it's pretty hard to grow wheat in a bomb-riddled field. Infrastructures were decimated, and industries had to shift completely to wartime production. But across the Atlantic, the United States, they played a different game, at least at first. While staying neutral, the US saw a golden opportunity, exporting foods, raw material, and most importantly, munitions. Explosives, steel machineries, you name it, and the Allies were paying through it. It wasn't until the US officially joined the war in 1917 that the government truly turned this global crisis into government and a money-making machine. How do they do it? Taxes, bond, and strict economic control. The War Act revenue of 1917 introduced steep taxes to fund military expenses, and the government encouraged citizens to buy Liberty bonds to support the troops. At home, industries were reshaped to fuel the war effort with labor forces directed towards manufacturing weapons and supplies. The war cost the war cost the US around 32 billion, but by the time it was over, the nation had emerged as an economic powerhouse, largely untouched by the devastation that crippled Europe. And that, my friends, set the stage for the US rise as a global financial leader. But war isn't fought on fields or in bank accounts. It affects people, their lives, and the values. And that's where social norms come in. The Great War didn't just reshape the borders, it reshaped society itself. For men, patriotism, sacrifice, and nationalism were the expectations, almost as if one's worth was measured by their willingness to fight. Meanwhile, women were thrust into roles they'd never been allowed to hold before: factory workers, mechanics, and office clerks, taking over jobs left behind by men headed off to war. They weren't just working, they were also expected to maintain their homes, support the families, and keep morale high. The shift was not temporary. As women proved their capacity, perceptions changed, paving the way for future movements, especially the fight for suffrage. Let's not forget the government's role in shaping political opinion. Through heavy propaganda, citizens were bombarded with messages that framed the war as a noble cause and the enemies were a monstrous threat. Posters, films, and speeches fueled nationalistic fervor, making it clear to support the war will be seen as a traitor. Of course, even in war, people need a break. So let's talk about entertainment. Despite the horror of war, soldiers and civilians alike found a way to escape, even if it was just for a moment. Entertainment wasn't about fun. It was about a way to survive mentally, to keep spirits up and to create some sense of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic world. Music was a powerful escape, especially for soldiers. Military bands played at encampments, and many soldiers formed their own small musical groups. Instruments like harmonicas and accordions were very popular in the trenches, as they were very easy to carry and could bring a sense of home to a war zone. Songs often had a patriotic or more boosting theme, but there were also humorous tunes that made light of a military life. concept parties were a huge hit. These were small traveling performances put on by soldiers for soldiers. Think of them as impromptu talent shows in the trenches. These performances include scene comedy sketches and even drag performances, or men dressed up as women for comedic effect. Laughter, after all, was one of the best weapons against despair. Where there are soldiers, there are games, trench life, and where there are soldiers, there are games, and where there are games, there's gambling. Trench life was long and often boring, so card games became a favorite and essential pastime. Popular games included Brag, Pontoon, Crown and Anchor. These were easy to play with limited space and minimal supplies, making them perfect for war zones. Many of these games were also involved betting, so it wasn't uncommon for soldiers to gamble their meals with prizes. This ranged from cigarettes to rations, anything on that winning ace. Dice games were another popular pastime, with soldiers going so far as to craft them from whatever they could find. Sports remained a huge part of military life. Football, or soccer for the Americans, was especially popular in British and German troops. In fact, during the famous Christmas truce of 1914, soldiers from both sides put down their weapons and played a friendly game of football in no man's land. For a brief moment, enemies became teammates, a stark reminder these soldiers were just people caught up in something bigger than themselves. Other popular sports included cricket, baseball, and boxing. These weren't just for fun, they helped maintain physical fitness and boost morale. Prisoner of war camps, organized sporting events were even held to keep prisoners active and mentally engaged. For those who preferred solitude, of course, writing and drawing became essential. Soldiers daily wrote letters home describing their experiences in vivid, emotional details. Some kept diaries, which would later provide historians like you and me with crucial insights into the life of the trenches. Others turned to poetry, expressing their thoughts in ways that a composer never could capture. Drawing was just another outlet. Some soldiers sketched the landscape of war, while others created cartoons mocking military life and those in the lead. These drawings often appeared in trench newspapers, small soldier-ran publications filled with satire, poetry, and war commentary. Think of them as the memes of World War One. War changes everything, economies, societies, and even how people find joy in dark times. But despite destruction, World War One reshaped the world in ways that no one could ever have imagined. This impact of the war didn't end with the Treaty of Versailles. It lingered in economies and social structures, and even the way people viewed the world. And while the war was filled with loss, those who lived through it found ways to keep going, to laugh, to play, and to create. And that's all for today's history segment. See you next week. World War II.